Google, is now referred to by venture capitalists as the kill zone. Because if you try to step a small business into that, one of two things happens. It either gets bought up when it shows its worth, and before it can actually grow into something that's really strong and valuable, or it just gets wiped out.
That
and
sound
we're
actually,
launching, that was another one
that was Jeff Bezos
dropped.
fainting, actually.
That's right.
Yeah.
But think about it. Venture capital in this area over the last half dozen years or so has dropped by about 20%. Because that opportunity to do what you do best, to come up with a great idea, to work your heart out to make it happen, to be able to compete on a level playing field, is taken away by these platform giants. So my view is break those things apart and we will have a much more competitive, robust market in America. That's how capitalism should work.
Now, what's interesting to me in that pitch to this room is it's still in the framework of, if we do this, it'll be better for everybody.
Yeah. Well, everybody except
right.
the guy right at the top that
so that's what I want to
ask right now.
One of the kind of reigning ideologies that I think a lot about, that I think has done a lot of damage to this country over the last many years, is the idea of the win-win, the kind of cult of the win-win. That we can make the world better without hurting anybody. And I wonder, the tech companies are sort of the win-winniest part of that cult. The bigger Google is, the more money Google is, the more money Facebook has, everything will be great. And I think we now all have a sense that that's not quite right. So for justice to be done on some of these issues, who actually has to do worse in America? Who has to maybe have fewer homes? Who has to maybe have fewer options about where to put their money? Who actually has to come down a peg for the general welfare to improve?
So the thing I just described, right? What happens there, the monopolist will make fewer monopoly profits. Boo-hoo.
Speaking of another monopolist, Mark Zuckerberg, who made his money with Facebook and is now pledging to get rid of all the diseases through his philanthropy, even though Facebook is something of a plague itself. Serious question as a law professor. Based on what you know from the public reporting or your secret sources, do you think Facebook, in addition to maybe being a bad actor, has potentially criminal exposure, or Zuckerberg or Sheryl Sandberg, for what they've done to our electoral process?
Wow. Actually, there's a problem here. And I'm going to do it both ways. I only know what I've seen in the papers. That's all you can do, what you read online. But part of the problem we have is we have a lot of lagging law and investigation in this area. The notion of opening up your site to manipulation by others, let me just put it this way, was not a crime in 1934 when we were last revisiting laws in this area. And in part, this is part of what I think about when I think about the big tech companies. There are parts about big tech that frankly are just like the railroads of the Teddy Roosevelt era, right? The advantage the railroads had, go back to the big monopoly of the late 1800s, right? So we're going through the Industrial Revolution. The railroads were the place you had to be. If you had a steel mill, you had to be able to get your goods onto the railroad and get them delivered into the places where construction was taking place. There was no other economical way to do it, just as a practical matter. You had to get your wheat and your corn onto the railroads, or else you were just going to be destroyed. And what happened? The railroads figured out that they could do two things. They could start pricing differentially depending on how desperate you were, or depending on whether or not, you'll see the analogy, they also had a competitor in the field, or they would do the other. They would start their own steel company, seeing that steel companies could make real profits, and they would, with the steel company, then give discount rates to move the steel along, so that meant you could sell at a cheaper price and raise the rates for the competing steel company, kind of the equivalent of put it on page 1, put it back on page 16. So in that sense, what's new is old. We're watching the same kind of, when someone gets market dominance, how they then start to destroy competition. That the very world that gave them birth, that is that opportunity to get out there and grow something, now has grown big enough to start destroying everything around it. And in that sense, it's very much like the old world. The part that seems to me to be new in this is the information part of it. Everybody's always wanted better information, right? We've had corporate spies forever, and everybody always wanted better information. But man, the information now that you can get on people, right? So why would a giant buy a company like Nest, right? Now, maybe because it's got a good business model, but maybe it has a bucket of information embedded in it about when you wake up and when you go to bed and whether or not someone's homesick and 58 bazillion other things. And the trick about information is it's not linear, right? It's not like having one piece of information, having 5 pieces of information is only 5 times better. No, this is a slope that climbs like crazy. So we watch an area where the business model not only has the part about selling coffee makers, totally get it, but also has the information that a shopper paused over a coffee maker, didn't even buy it, right? But stayed there for a little while. And that shopper, we know 6 other things about them, can start pinpointing the business's response, not every business's response, but the response only of the giant. The consequence of that, it seems to me, is that we have to think about competitive markets. That's what my announcement yesterday, my proposal is now, about protecting competitive markets by breaking these giants up. But it also means the urgency of new approaches and new laws and new restrictions around data privacy, data sales becomes more crucial
I hear you
than
on
ever.
that, but on the specific thing of a foreign cyber war operation from an adversary that we now know they really slow-walked the government, they evaded journalists, they really prioritized growth lust in many ways over dealing with that. Do you think the question of criminal liability is something we should be thinking about with Facebook?
Well, I think this is what the attorneys general around the country can look at. And if we had an attorney general for the United States of America that was interested in enforcing the law,
that'd be interesting.
that would certainly be a place to
Right.
look.
Reading your most recent book,
Notice
which
that was in the subjunctive.
I did. Reading your most recent book, This Fight is Our Fight, an excellent book that I recommend to you all. I sort of picked up on a theme that comes again and again in both your life and your policy. I think everybody in this room would associate the idea of a rigged system with something you've talked about for a long time. But when you tell personal stories in the book, your own and others, one of the themes is a cultural consequence of rigged systems, which is that rigged systems tend to make a lot of people feel that systemic failures are actually personal failures.
Yes.
Right? Big food is conspiring over here out of the view of regular people, and you feel, gosh, I just can't diet successfully. Yeah. Or big tech is doing what it's doing, or big tobacco, et cetera. Can you talk about from your own life? I'm thinking about the story of you and your mother having a fight about college, other circumstances in your life where you've kind of first felt, or someone around you felt it was a personal failure, and it took you time to understand how it originated elsewhere?
So I actually want to tell a story that I first learned in Austin, Texas. And that is, my co-authors may actually be here, Dr. Terry Sullivan and Professor Jay Westbrook.
Are they here? This could get like Jerry Springer,
yeah,
like the academic later, Jerry
right?
Springer.
Exactly. Come on down,
yeah, exactly.
Right, okay. But the 3 of us are baby professors. Terry's a demographer, and Jay and I are at the law school. And we do our first study of families in bankruptcy. And just so you understand, this is back in the 80s, bankruptcy filings are doing this. And the dominant narrative in America at this point is, well, it's just people who go out and overspend, who are just too irresponsible. They spend too much time at the mall. They buy more than they can afford. And there are books that are written about this, the overspent American, affluenza, the millionaire next door. So the notion is, if you're in bankruptcy, it's your own fault. If you're broke, it's your own fault. So Jay and Terry and I start studying the families in bankruptcy. And let me just tell you what we find. These are largely hardworking people, middle class, working class folks by every consistent measure. Their education, the fact that they bought homes, the fact that they had jobs that had good occupational prestige scores, right? Every way that you could kind of measure them, who were in desperate financial trouble, right? Terrible financial trouble. They were so far in debt that being dead flat broke, which is what bankruptcy could give them, looked like a vast improvement in their lives. So we asked these folks to fill out a sheet of paper, and it was basic demographic information because it hadn't been collected by the courts, how old they were, what their race was, gender was, how many children at home, just to kind of get a picture of who they are. And at the very last question, because we'd promised the judges we'd hold this to one page, we asked them to turn the paper over and fill in, just explain in their own words why they'd filed for bankruptcy, what had gone wrong in their lives. And you turn it over, and I'll tell you, some were really clear on what had gone wrong. Some people were really mad, right? It was Bill Henry, and he didn't pay my alimony, and he lives at 115 Elm Street. Go arrest his sorry ass, you know.
He'll be there after 4.
Yeah, exactly, man. And some would just have a word or two. But the number of people who poured their hearts out on these forms to describe their own stupidity, as they called it. I guess I should have read the credit card contract more carefully. I didn't understand that the interest rates would double the amount that I owed in the space of 3 months. I guess I should have known better about the mortgage. I shouldn't, after I sold my wedding ring and my car and everything to try to pay my debts, and I now owe more than I did before, I was stupid to get caught by these people. And they described a world of financial predators, of people who just had put out fraudulent products, had picked the bones clean of these folks. And what did these people do? They blamed themselves for being losers in the great game of life. And it was a part of what pulled me into the fights. My first political fights were around bankruptcy. Because along about this time, the credit card companies look at the number of people filing for bankruptcy, and here's what they say. If we could close that door just a little bit, get half as many people to file, they're still going to have a whole lot of trouble, right? But if we could get half as many people to file or hold them off for 3 years, while we just keep pounding the dirt out of them to try to get a few more interest payments out of them, a few more dollars out of them, we could improve, said the credit card companies, the bottom line by another point or two. And they went to Congress to ask Congress for this, hired all the lobbyists, had all the bought and paid for experts. And who was on the side of the debtors? On the side of the people who'd had their bones picked clean. They had nobody. And they had no lobbyists. They had no one. And they were filled with self-blame. To me, that was the ultimate of a system that was rigged. The financially sophisticated had figured out how to prey on people who were at the economic margins, how to prey on even people kind of in the middle, how to prey on students, targeted communities of color, went after Latinos. I mean, you can see it in their documentation. They ultimately, on some of this, got sued for it, and it all came out in public. They picked people for their vulnerabilities, targeted those vulnerabilities, and then made billions of dollars for them, and at the end of the day, blamed the people. Said, shame on you for being in so much debt and ending up in bankruptcy. And by the way, we're going to change the laws so that the last little bit of a handhold that you might be able to get in this economy to stabilize yourself economically will be taken away from you. That's when I got into this fight. That was it. By the way, I should say about that fight, the bankruptcy, this starts back in the mid-1990s. The bankruptcy companies were the credit card companies were so sure that they were going to be able to do this. They had it baked. They had all of the Republicans and half of the Democrats. And they were so sure they were going to be able to roll that thing through Congress with no trouble at all, because there's nobody on the other side. That when I waded into the fight, and others, a few others, academics, consumer advocates wade into the fights. God bless the labor unions. They waded into the fights. They did. Consumer Reports waded into the fight. When we got a few people in the fight on the other side and just kept holding them off and holding them off and holding them off, here's how the story goes. We held them for 10 years, and in the end, we lost. The money and the lobbying paid off. The families got blamed by the United States Congress, and the law was changed to make it work better and better for a handful of rich folks and just to kick everybody else to the curb. That was my first lesson in Washington.
To the present, you've been friends with Bernie Sanders for a long time. Mm-hmm. You were much younger when you met him.
I think.
Bernie was. You were much younger when you met him. Bernie was the exact same age he is now. Not long ago, I'm told you went to see him and talk about the two of you possibly running for president, each of you running for president. Is it incorrect that he discouraged you from running, and if so, on what grounds?
So Bernie and I had a private dinner, and my view is that dinner stays private.
I've heard you say you're not a kind of judge of anybody else's ideology or worldview than your own. But I think as this primary's developed, you really have this smorgasbord of ideas on the Democratic side that's emerging that's actually great. It feels like a really broad intellectual contest of everything that could be in a Democratic primary is well represented in this one. Can you explain, the law and law professors are very good at distinctions, right? Helping people understand distinctions. If I were to kind of oversimplify a taxonomy of democratic socialism, your brand of kind of saving capitalism and reforming capitalism, and maybe a kind of more centrist corporate Democrat, can you explain the core difference between those three
Nope, I can only explain what I do.
But help people who don't know the difference between what you and Bernie are really saying. What's the crux of the difference?
Bernie has to speak to what democratic socialism is.
But you are not one.
And I am not. And the centrists have to speak to whatever they are doing. What I can speak to is what I'm doing.
They actually can't speak to it because they're too busy on phone calls with rich people.
Well, but all I can tell you is what I believe, and that is there's an enormous amount to be gained from markets, that markets create opportunities. I always think of it as, infrastructure is like plowing fields, and so seeds can grow, and they can grow in lots of different ways, and that's what markets are all about. But markets have to have rules. They have to have a cop on the beat. Markets without rules are theft. And without a cop on the beat to enforce those rules, what will happen over time is that in a field, one player will become dominant and start to destroy the market opportunities for everyone else. And it has lots of variations. We'll start to build profit models that are based on cheating people because they can get away with it if there's no cop on the beat. So what I believe in and what I keep trying to emphasize is I want to see markets work where it's a level playing field, where everybody gets a chance to get out there, get in the game, and have an opportunity to build something that's real. That's what I believe in.
Do you agree with the phrase, every billionaire is a policy failure, or that's from a staffer of AOC, and AOC herself said, a society that allows for billionaires is not a moral society. Do you agree with those statements?
Well,
should there be billionaires?
I need more context around that. So if you describe a world in which every child, before it's born, gets great health care, and that health care is always available all the way through, and that's true, you can't tell a difference in the health care available to a poor child, a child born into the working class, and a child born into wealth, and those children all get similar daycare opportunities and childcare opportunities. They get similar early childhood education in K through 12 and have a chance to go to tech school or go to college. If they then go into a market that's a pretty fair market, doesn't have to be perfect at every place, but is a fair market with a lot of opportunity for people to get into it, if they're not taken out of the game because of the color of their skin, or because of their religion, or because of their gender, or because of who they love, if they have a chance to compete in that world and make something, and if the consequence of that is there are some billionaires and some millionaires and some thousandaires, I think that's probably a world that works. I'm for that.
So you're basically for Norwegian billionaires, but American billionaires with this background conditions in society prevailing are less your speed.
But that's the point. A world in which there are billionaires, I'll just give you two examples. It's billionaires who go to Congress and persuade Congress to give them giant tax breaks while they want to take away health care from tens of millions of children, while they want to cut back on money that we invest into education. And the reason I say that's wrong is, I'm going to put this a different way. The basic idea of a democracy, we have to remind ourselves from time to time, is majority rule, right? So if most people would like to see us, for example, invest in education or make sure everybody has health care or start fighting back against climate change, that's what you'd expect to see happen in a democracy. But when a billionaire, when a corporate executive can go to Washington and be heard because that executive or that billionaire has an army of lobbyists and an army of lawyers and an army of PR people and an army of bought and paid for experts, and tens of millions of Americans can't be heard, then that's no longer a democracy. Because you may have different amounts of money in a democracy, but you should not have a different voice in Washington. Every person should have the same voice in Washington.
I want to pick up on this theme of corruption. You recently made this announcement about your own fundraising practices. You're going to not spend time calling rich donors. You're not going to do these big dollar fundraisers anymore in the primary. You know, I think one of the things that's so most persuasive to people, I always tell my writing students, is your experience is going to be more persuasive to people than your ideas. Can you talk, as someone who has experienced this, who's done those calls in the past, who's gone to those fundraisers, who's had to sit there listening to some rich guy explaining to you his big idea about his boat or whatever, can can you explain, can you give us the kind of sociology of why that is corrupting? Have you ever felt yourself standing in a party feeling like, this is not good for me, this is changing even me?
You know, maybe it's because I came to politics much later than most people. Remember, I had a real life. It's true. So I've never felt overwhelmed by much of anybody. But I actually want to pitch this one exactly the reverse. I want to be able to spend my time with people who may be able to kick in $5 or may not be able to kick in anything or may be able to kick in $30 to make a campaign work. And there's a very specific reason for this. This is a Democratic primary. And we have to figure out as Democrats how we're going to win in 2020. And when we hit 2020, we know one thing for sure. There's going to be plenty of money for the two final candidates, plenty of ads, plenty of back and forth, plenty of, noise level will be over the top. Our one potential comparative advantage between now and the general election as Democrats is that we have a chance to build a grassroots army. And we're not going to build that grassroots army if our candidates are spending all their time in LA and San Francisco and New York scooping up money, and then they just plan to run a bunch of TV ads. That is what will already be there in the general. Our chance right now, the very fact that we have over a year-long runway in this, the very fact that we can actually do living rooms and high school auditoriums and diners, the very fact that we can do that means we have a chance right now to make this face-to-face, person-to-person, neighbor-to-neighbor, community-to-community, all across this country. And I think as Democrats, we should seize on that opportunity. And the way we will do that is to run all of our campaigns as grassroots up. No corporate PAC money, no Washington lobbyist money, and not spend all our time with millionaires. I think that's how we'll build it.
I have to tell you, after 2016, a very wealthy donor to Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party said to me, she said, I look back and I realized I Instagrammed a different photo of me with Hillary every week or every 2 weeks for most of 2016. This woman does not work in politics, just a rich person. Mm-hmm. And she said, as soon as Hillary lost, I realized, oh my gosh, why was she with me so many times? I want to ask you a question that someone like President Trump probably couldn't answer, but I think you can. Lawyers are good at being able to fight both sides of the case. What is the biggest, I think we all have this, the biggest doubt you have, it could be a small doubt, but the biggest small doubt you have about your own philosophy? Where do you sometimes think, maybe my opponents are right about something that I don't quite see?
It's a good question. I'm serious about this. I always wonder about either one of two things. Either additional data that I don't have yet, that I haven't seen, I can't see around the corner to know that, yeah, it looks like, and you've surmised it ought to work this way, but if only you had one more turn of the crank on information. So they may have better information. It's also the case, it happens in the tech world, that I don't see what the business model is. And I don't see why you bought that thing.
But it needs to be easier to find lattes.
Yeah. And so it's a question of what I haven't yet gotten enough experience around to understand what's going on. And as a result, you can end up with policies that kind of end up in the wrong place. By the way, I will say on this, going back to the bankruptcy work, when Jay and Terry and I first started doing the research in bankruptcy, we did this thing that was regarded as just crazy, and that is we actually went out and looked at families that were in bankruptcy. and collected
You mean you studied the
data about
actual
them.
people affected by something?
We studied the actual people. But here's what made this, I just want you all to have the insight around this. At that time, Washington had just rewritten the bankruptcy laws. And they had rewritten the bankruptcy laws on the assumption that they knew why people were bankrupt and who those people were and what problems they had. And therefore, here were the set of rules that were going to help solve those problems. And we found some of them were right, and some of them were just desperately wrong. And so long before I got into the United States Senate, I had cut my teeth on a very stark understanding that you can't simply identify a problem, say, oh, we've got a problem, pass a law to solve that problem and assume it did solve the problem. That a big part of this is to go back, you got to keep looping back in and collecting the data again. And so I think that's that's what I think about everything. Somebody who disagrees with me, bring me some more information. Or tell me where I've got the argument wrong in a piece of it. Because I could. I do.
You're going to get so many DMs that you have no idea what to do with.
Okay, good. I'll be ready.
I want to ask you about your view of America.
Okay.
There has been a fascinating debate in recent years in books and everywhere about how to think about the origins of America and what that means for today. And one way to think about that debate is sort of Ta-Nehisi Coates versus Barack Obama, and Ta-Nehisi writing about the divergence between his view of America and Barack Obama's. And to summarize, I think the Ta-Nehisi position, this is a country stained at the root by certain original sins, by slavery, by genocide. And he contrasts that with a kind of Barack Obama view of only in America is my story even possible, this country brilliantly founded with flaws, with unfinished business, but there's a difference between those views. And I think there's a lot that's been changing in all of our consciousness around how we think about America. Where do you find yourself on that spectrum?
I think they're both right. And that's the heart of America right now, that we are a nation that was founded on high-minded principles and on the backs of slaves. And that a refusal, we have embraced one and tell that story from generation to generation to our children, and we tell it with love and pride, while we fail to acknowledge the other half of that story. And I see this in far more practical terms today. Until we confront the impact of race that lies right at the heart of the founding of this country and plays on through until this very day, we can't be the country of our best ideals. You know, I just want to, let me just do one little piece on this. I talk a lot about economics, the economics of families. The number one way in America that a working family builds wealth, anybody know? Housing. It's homes. It's homes. For those who can buy homes, and this has been true for the better part of a century, if you can just get your foot in the door and buy a home in America, it's an appreciating asset. You pay down the debt over time. It acts as a collateral if you want to start a small business, and if you really, really get lucky in your family, and grandma and grandpa can survive until they stay in the house until they die, you pass on wealth to the next generation. And it's how, generation after generation, families do better. And children go to school longer, and they do better, and they move up the economic ladder. So it should be no surprise to anybody in this room that the United States government decided quite deliberately back in the 30s, and there's some even before that, to subsidize the purchase of housing for white people and to discriminate against black people who tried to buy homes. And so the part that may surprise some people is to remember in the 1960s, that was still illegal in America. It's called redlining. And in the 1960s, in 1960, no surprise, the black-white homeownership gap is 27 percentage points. And just think what that means, generation after generation after generation, 27 percentage points. So along we have a civil rights movement, passed civil rights laws, no more discrimination on housing, no more discrimination on employment, passed the Voting Rights Act, right? And by golly, boy, law matters. We actually see the black-white wealth gap starts to shrink, and the housing gap starts to shrink. This is the best part about this one. Housing goes up for everybody. It's just going up at an accelerating rate for African Americans. Okay, right? And then giant financial institutions glance over at communities of color and say, a lot of folks over there own homes. That means equity, something that we could dip our little beaks into. And they targeted communities of color for the worst mortgages, not to buy homes, to suck value out of the homes that had already been bought. Went door to door in some of these communities, also sold terrible mortgage. Worst products that were developed in the lead up to the crash were marketed deliberately into black and brown communities. Then the crash comes, like this isn't bad enough, the worst foreclosure practices were used in black and brown communities. And again, you don't have to take my word for it. There were lawsuits that were settled over this for hundreds of millions of dollars when all of this came out. But here's where I just want to wind this one to today. The government and its role, both its aggressive role in terms of subsidizing and discriminating, and then later its role of saying, la, 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 I can't hear you, while people are marketing fraudulent products. Where are we today in America? That black-white housing gap that was 27 points back when housing discrimination was legal, today is 30 points. 30 points in America. Race matters. And until we say so and attack the problem head on, we are not going to fix it. And that's part of why I'm in this spot.
That's such an important example of your former Harvard colleague, Steven Pinker, has made quite a name for himself saying this is the best the world's ever been. I see everybody here reading this Steven Pinker books. And I always say the world is getting better and better for Steven Pinker. So the Skim newsletter recently described you, I think right after you'd entered the race, highest profile Dem in the race. If you don't know her, you've probably heard about the controversy about her ancestry. So I don't want to litigate that issue here, but I want to ask you a broader question about how that episode and episodes in your life have educated you about your own whiteness. I think a lot of white people in this moment are actually on a journey of understanding what was often just considered the default setting of Americanness. What have you learned about being white?
Well, you know, as the data I just talked about showed, the differences that protect us are often unseen. And the importance of being able to get beyond that just can't be overstated. For Native American tribes across this country, you know, there's a lot of difference among tribes. They face very different economic circumstances, different histories, different languages, different cultures. They are nations. And the relationship between the United States government and the tribal nations has been one in which our own federal government has failed repeatedly. We have obligations that we have failed to live up to through obligations we made through treaties that we have not met, obligations that we made through statutes we passed and then turned our backs on. And at this point in America, leave it to the tribes to try to figure out how to lobby the U.S. government to meet its obligations. As a nation, it is our obligation, and we should be meeting those obligations.
I want to ask you, in your launch ad, I was very taken with your brothers. And sticking with this question of identity in America, your brothers, and I'm saying this purely superficially as a guy watching a video, your brothers look to me like the America that most fears the changing identity of the country. I'm not talking about your brothers specifically, but big, beefy white guys who are veterans, right?
Yeah, with dogs.
With dogs.
That's the
from
clue,
Oklahoma.
Though. But that's the clue. These
right,
are good
exactly.
guys. Yeah.
So I want to ask you a question that goes deeper than policy, which is, it seems to me one of the really big mega trends in American life that is causing a lot of this context that we're in is the fear of people like your brothers about losing their sense of belonging in a country where men have to fall to the level of equality, white people have to fall to the level of equality. And it's a big problem, whether or not you sympathize with that fear, it's a big problem when so many people have that feeling of the strangers in your own land thing that sociologist Arlie Roth-Hauschild wrote about. How do you think about addressing tens and tens of millions of people over the next many years trying to figure out, men trying to figure out how to live in a gender equal society, white people trying to figure out how to live in a multicultural society without feeling threatened?
So I think the first part, it's interesting you'd raise this. So I have these 3 older brothers. I am the baby. I was what used to be called the late in life baby. My mother always just called me the surprise. But I have these 3 older brothers. They all went off and joined the military. They're all retired. They're all back in Oklahoma, living 17 miles apart, right, in a triangle. And one is a Democrat. And
keep trying.
I'm working here. The 4 of us love each other. And what's key to me is to talk to my brothers about the things we agree on, to find the way in. So, it's a funny thing. I won't name the brother, although they'll be able to figure this out. Who would make all kinds of remarks about what he didn't think about what women ought to be doing, blah, 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 until he had a grown daughter. And, well, it's a little different with his grown daughter. And the idea that she isn't paid or wouldn't be paid, what some guy who probably isn't working as hard as she is getting paid, not right. And proud of every accomplishment. In fact, you can kind of run through the whole set of issues. He wants her and her children to have health care. He wants her to have access to good child care. He wants her to have a lot of good job opportunities. He wants her to be able to buy a home. Now,
has that led him to generalize to all the other women yet, though?
Actually, I think a lot, yes. But here's my point. If we frame broadly and then try to pound him with it, I never got him. But if I start at the personal, the part that matters and feels really tangible, I'm not talking about change, I'm talking about whether or not our grandchildren should have access to affordable child care and pre-K that's paid. Oh, yeah. Then he's ready to come in. And I say that by way of saying, I think we're making a real mistake in this country. I think we've kind of started putting people in their pods, their pockets, and not talking about the values that we share. There are things my brothers and I are never going to agree on. And doesn't matter to me. I'll fight them as long as I have to fight them on those things. But the point is, there's much that we do agree on. And actually, let me make a larger point here. So it doesn't just sound like...
Are you talking about identity politics? Are you really saying identity politics is making things harder rather than easier?
So my real point is on economic issues, you stick with core economic issues, America's a progressive country. That's not just Democratic America. You go run the numbers. I'm a data nerd, right? Go look at the numbers of Americans who think that we should raise the minimum wage, right? The number of Americans who think the government has an important role to play in making sure that every American has access to health care. Go look at the numbers on how many people think that we ought to have child care available and we ought to have universal pre-K. The number of people who think that the student loan debt burden in America today is obscene and want to see it reduced. By the way, the number of people who I warm to this, the number of people who think that we ought to have more regulation over giant financial institutions rather than less regulation. You go through a core progressive economic agenda, more taxation of the richest among us. My ultra-millionaires' wealth tax, taxing the 75,000 richest families in America, 2% tax on the fortunes above $50 million. That not only is wildly popular among Democrats and independents, a majority of Republicans support that proposal.
That was one of the most astonishing poll numbers I saw.
So
it's like Republicans finally know they're actually not all billionaires.
So, yeah.
They finally got that bank statement. They're like, oh, those are decimal. Yeah.
But that is the heart of it. It's that they get the core pieces. When I go out and talk about corruption in Washington, the fact that we have a government that dances to the tune of giant drug companies and doesn't help people who are trying to get a prescription filled. We have a government that dances to the tune of oil companies that want to drill everywhere, but not to people who are desperately worried about climate change. When we talk about those kinds of, they get the core argument. And that is that it's not a level playing field. And the reason it's not level is because government in Washington has its hand on the scale for the rich and the powerful. That's there. We keep the fight there. This is one we're going to win.
I want to ask you, as a sitting senator, this might be your responsibility before you know it. Based on what you know for sure today, I don't ask you to predict the future, but based on what you know today, would you vote to impeach President Trump on a well-brought charge?
The Mueller report is allegedly going to come out any day now.
I feel Mueller's like this guy who keeps taking you to a weekend away, and you think he's going to propose every weekend, and it's like, is this guy ever... He puts his hand in his pocket, and you think the ring is definitely in the pocket, and then there's no ring. There's no ring. That's just me.
That said, you should remember he has produced 34 indictments and guilty pleas already.
But based on what
I don't know
know
about you, but I never had a boyfriend that good. So my view on this one is, come on. Any smart lawyer says, get all the data in front of you, get all of the evidence in front of you, because it is such an important political moment as well. So make sure you got the whole mountain there when you get ready to make a decision on how to act next. So I want to see that Mueller report. It's coming.
So we're getting to that part of the hour where people get a little restless. So we're going to do a lightning round.
Oh, God.
And I know you're a senator, but we're going to suspend the filibuster right now. You got to really do.
I've been for filibuster reform for years now.
Exactly. So these are
all
yay or nays very fast. Mm-hmm. If you really can't answer it, you can just pass. Mm-hmm. Marie Kondo or embrace the mess?
Oh. Marie Kondo. Yeah.
Your favorite feminist icon, living or dead?
Oh. Frances Perkins. Oh, some of you don't even know.
The Perkins family is over there.
Damn.
Yeah.
Secretary of Labor, Social Security, the first woman to serve in a cabinet office, and who stood up. Yeah. Yeah, right? No, you didn't know. Oh, jeez. I thought I was getting a little reinforcement here in the front row. Not at all. Okay.
How many books do you read a year, roughly, and what time of day do you read?
I read probably 2 a week.
Are you kidding?
I do a lot of books on tape. They're audible. It's now migrated. So they're in my ear. That's how I read your book. You sound good.
Thank you. Thank you. It was actually Morgan Freeman.
No, it wasn't. And besides, I can put people on 1 3/4 speed if it's like, come on, get on with this. I'm
not going to ask whether that
Before this sounds so highfalutin, I should point out, I read a lot of trash.
Trashiest thing you've recently read?
Right now, I'm reading the 5th in the series of Victor the Assassin.
Wow. So that'll shape your foreign policy.
That's right.
So you and I go drinking. What are you having?
Oh, beer. Michelob Ultra. The club soda of beers.
Right.
Come on,
Right.
people.
When they go low. Let's do that one, actually. When they go low, we go high or we hit harder?
We hit harder.
Donald Trump is a racist, yes or no?
Yes?
Are you a
that a
populist,
question?
yes or no?
Yes.
Best TV show you've ever binged, because I know you're a binger.
Oh, The Wire. Favorite character, Omar. Best lines, a man's gotta have a code.
Right.
Yeah.
I like
Am
that.
I right?
I like that. The law professor can appreciate that.
Yeah.
In your case, United States Code. AOC, overhyped or underhyped?
Right hyped.
Reparations, yes or no?
It's time to start the conversation. I mean, you gotta see what it's gonna look like. But we've got to confront the ugly history of slavery and open that conversation. Sweeping it under the rug is not going to make it any better. We've actually kind of tried that for 150 years, and it's not working.
Now, the opposite of that question, your favorite luxury splurge? It's all right, we're in a safe space, sort of.
Favorite luxury splurge? I'm trying to think. Oh, good cream.
You should talk to Bernie about it. All-time favorite American president?
Teddy Roosevelt. Go TR. Come on, the Trust Buster. Am I going to have to keep doing this? The Trust Buster, right? And the environmentalist. We have a national park system because of Teddy Roosevelt. Go Teddy. Go Teddy.
Last one in the lightning round, and then I'm going to ask a question to send these folks off. Should marijuana be legal?
Yes.
There will now be marijuana coming through the aisles. She's a senator, that's how it works.
I've been trying to tell Mitch McConnell that for a long time. He says no.
Do you understand how much better Mitch McConnell would be with just a little bit of weed?
You're right.
Not everything requires revolution. Some things can just be reformed slightly. That's your whole thing. I want to ask you a question that gets asked of me a lot, and I don't know how to answer it. So I'm going to outsource it to you.
Oh, great.
And it comes from...
Is this known as a lateral pass?
Right,
Okay.
exactly. It comes from the demographic that I think is heavily represented in this room, which is young or youngish people who are idealistic, who want to make a difference in the world, and who I think have been subject to a story that has been very influential for their generation, which is that the way you change the world is by starting an app, or going to Silicon Valley, or going to Morgan Stanley and McKinsey first so you learn how to make PowerPoints so you can help Africa one day, even though you've never been to Africa. Do you have any idea how tired people in Africa are of PowerPoints from America? And I get these pleading emails many times a day saying, I was sucked in by that story. I want to make a difference. I now realize the institutions that I tried to do that in were not right. I was duped. Besides just supporting your campaign or a campaign,
What do you mean besides supporting my campaign? That sounds good to me.
After they're done with that.
Okay.
But if folks here are thinking about the next 10 or 20 years of their life to not change the world through Silicon Valley, if they've fallen out of favor with that theory, how should they think about spending a career, spending a life, given where we are in this country and given the kind of change this country requires?
So I have two suggestions. The first one is government service. In fact, can I do just a sec on government service? I actually got to build an agency, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It was so much fun. And here was the deal. Just for those of you who don't know anything about the agency and are thinking, why are people clapping for a government agency? The financial crash was brought on basically by giant financial institutions that figured out they could make $1 bazillion by selling people mortgages that would destroy their lives. They were selling grenades with the pins pulled out. And then when they exploded, it not only brought down literally millions of families in this country, it brought down the whole economy. My pitch after that happened was we needed one federal agency to gather up all of the laws on consumer protection and to have both the authority and the responsibility to be the cop on the beat and make sure people don't get cheated on mortgages and credit cards and their bank accounts and so on and so forth. And that was authorized into law in the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010. And President Obama asked me to come and set it up. So I went to Washington for a year. It was my first time in any kind of government service. And two things struck me in that time that I'd just share with you. The first one was the number of good people who are already in government. And for all of the attacks that many people have launched, me included, on the people at the top whose policies I don't like or who have misbehaved, there are a lot of good folks doing a lot of good work in the public interest. And the second part was to build this agency. When I walked in the front door, it literally had no one in the agency. And by the time I left a year later, it was up and had a lot of functions it had to lead. We had about 1,000 employees. The people who applied, because they understood what this agency was trying to do and they just wanted to be part of it, there were young people, there were old people, there were people in between, there were people straight out of college, there were people who'd been lawyers for 20 years, there were people who'd been accountants, there were people who'd been in the trade, there were people who'd been in banking. I had a cowboy apply. It's true. It's true. He even sent a picture. He was a cute cowboy. He called himself a cowboy banker, which I really liked.
It's always a red flag when they put cowboy in the name.
Right. It was. But the point was, and I see this now, not just the people I get to visit with in Washington, but for example, the State Department, our diplomatic corps, the people who have committed their lives that they will represent our country around the world, and they will get better and more expert, and they will help inform our government and help inform the government where they are about America. And it's working for something bigger than yourself. So I strongly advise that. I also think there's enormously wonderful, exciting work being done by a lot of NGOs and their nonprofits and their charities who are always looking for good people. One last thing. Folks who've got lots and lots of money, like banks and law firms and McKinsey, make it real easy to go work for them. They pave a super highway from your door to their offices, and they throw flowers on it and to make it easy. The other jobs you've got to go look for. People who don't have that much money, entities that don't have that much money, they can't do the same thing. You actually have to go look for them, but they're worth it.
Well, I want to thank I want to thank you for your public service, and thank you for being real with us here, and coming to say it to their face. And thank you all for your attention, and good luck on the trail.
Thank you.